Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Discourse Lab. In this episode, Clay and I are joined by Dr. Luke Conway, a social and political psychologist and professor of psychology at Grove City College in Pennsylvania. Luke has published over 100 pieces on the psychology of politics and culture. He has served as an associate editor for the Society for Personality and Social Psychology's flagship journal and is an elected fellow of that journal and the Society of Experimental Social Psychology. He's also the author of Liberal Bullies and Complex Simplicity, and he writes for his Substack, The Apologetic Professor, plus the Conway Lab's Authoritarianism Tracker. We anchor part of the conversation in a recently published paper Luke co-authored titled An Adversarial Collaboration on the Rigidity-of-the-Right, Symmetry Thesis or Rigidity-of-Extremes? The answer depends on the question. So in plain terms, is political rigidity more common on the right, or is it basically symmetrical, showing up across both sides, especially at the extremes? And yes, we'll dive into what an adversarial collaboration actually is. From there, we talk about how measurement choices in social psychology shape what research finds, how hard it is to change your mind when new information shows up, how researchers define rigidity, and we talk about why the word authoritarian gets thrown around so loosely. One key point we address in this episode is that social psychology isn't ideologically balanced. Most researchers skew liberal and progressive, and that matters because it can shape the research agenda. A lot of findings end up interrogating conservatives more than liberals. On a personal note, having the opportunity to sit down with him was truly a special experience for me as an independent psychology scholar. Finally, if you enjoy the show, please consider leaving a comment on the streaming platform you're using. Your feedback helps us attract a larger audience, and we truly appreciate it. Well, that's about it for me. Let's get on with the show. This is Discourse Lab.
MAGA in Trump 2.0 is a cultural phenomenon.
I'm Anthony Rispo.
And I am Clayton Smith.
Is this the moment where I let you know that I think your therapist is incompetent or inadequate for you?
On this podcast, you'll hear a wide range of perspectives from an ideologically diverse suite of guests.
Social psychologists will just seamlessly import leftist ideology.
It's quite a radical idea, actually, to say that we're going to deregulate banking and big government out of all of these spheres of life in which it was previously involved.
Our goal? To use conversation to analyze ideas, test arguments, and question dogmas.
Terrorist speech, extremist speech, disinformation, misinformation, all of these concepts are inherently irreducibly subjective.
Now, let's head into the lab. Luke, thank you so much for joining us. Great to have you on the podcast. We've been trying to schedule this one for a while because Anthony in particular is a big fan of your work, and I, as I learn more about you, am becoming one as well. We probably would have mentioned this in the intro, but for those of you who are listening, one of the many reasons we wanted Luke to come on was because he co-authored a paper that I think has some very interesting implications, some interesting findings. And the title of that paper is An Adversarial Collaboration on the Rigidity-of-the-Right, Symmetry Thesis, or Rigidity-of-Extremes. The answer depends on the question. Now, if you're like me and you're very much a layman when it comes to psychology, don't worry. We're going to break into what that title means, what the findings were. We're going to kind of go into detail about the implications, and we're also going to translate it into a layman's speech that you all can understand if you're not psych nerds as much as Anthony and I'm sure obviously Luke is. We're just going to jump right into it here. And the first thing that I wanted to ask you, Luke, is actually related to kind of what I was just saying. What, in a very basic sense, is the finding of the study, or is this sort of central question of this study? And then why should someone like me who's like, I like psychology, it's interesting, but I'm not a super psych nerd, why should it matter to me? And what does it tell us about human nature, society, et cetera?
I'm absolutely delighted to be here. So it's an honor to get to talk to y'all today. So I think your two questions are related. Why you should care about it? We should especially care about it if you're conservative, because the primary theory, mostly by John Jost and that crowd for years, has been that conservatives are uniquely evil. They're really rigid. Liberals are the open-minded, beautiful people, and conservatives are dogmatic, hate-filled. That's the prevailing theory in my field of social psychology for decades. So you should probably care about that. That's what scientists are saying about you. That's their view of you. I think you should care about what scientists say. Now, the theme of what we did in this paper was take that theory. There's been people who have had pushback against that theory. So myself included, who have said, we believe in something more like symmetry, which is the fancy word in the paper, which just means we believe that pretty much conservatives and liberals are equal. They have similar motivations. They're equally prone to things like being rigid and dogmatic. There's dogmatism on both sides. There's open-mindedness on both sides. So over and against that conservatives are evil hypothesis, we've just said, well, look, there's good and bad on both sides. Okay. So what this project did was kind of unique. That's what adversarial collaboration, the title means. It brought together people from both sides of that debate, scientists, and we designed up front a study that we thought would help contribute to it was a fair test of the question, are conservatives actually sort of uniquely rigid, bad people, or is that distributed equally across both sides of the political spectrum? And we worked forever to design a study. We, defined rigidity. That took forever. We picked the measurement we all agreed on one measurement of rigidity. And then we designed some studies to test whether or not conservatives were in fact uniquely rigid. So that was the impetus of the project, was to kind of answer that question with a giant sample that was well-funded. It was run through the University of Pennsylvania, so it was run through Penn. It was a very well-funded study through Phil Tetlock and Corey Clark's research lab there. So that was what we did. I was very skeptical of it. I don't like being told what studies I can run by my opponent, so I was not really into the idea, to be honest with you, at the beginning. But in the end, I have to say, it was one of the best experiences of my career. It was what science is supposed to be. A bunch of people who maybe don't agree coming together to try to figure out the truth. That was what it was like. So I wish we would do more of this, to be honest with you, where our opponents and people across the spectrum can come together to try to design a project. Now, as to the results, I think it's in the eye of the beholder. The results, so there was a lot of variance amongst the people in the team, we all agreed on the test, but there was a lot of variance in how to interpret the results. I think what I'm going to say probably surprise you. One of the interesting things that happened here is I'm a symmetry guy. I'm the, guy who says there's equal authoritarian on the left and the right. There's equal rigidity on the left and the right. Some of my most famous work has to do with showing left-wing authoritarianism is a real problem. Okay, so I was kind of the most, conservatives are equal guy going in, and my primary opponent, if you will, Danny Osborne, and I ended up being the ones that agreed on the interpretation more than, we actually sided with each other against the rest of the team, which isn't in the paper, but that's actually what happened behind the scenes, okay? And the issue was, so here's what happened. Consistently across all of our data, conservatives showed slightly more rigidity. And in this instance, by rigidity, we mean we gave them a finding, and we asked them their beliefs about something. We gave them a scientific finding that would support that belief, and then we saw if they updated their beliefs. Did they actually account for, were they rigid? Did they hold to their original thing in the face of this new evidence, or were they willing to update their beliefs? Okay, we found that conservatives were less likely to update, so they were a little bit more rigid, and I interpreted that to mean as slight evidence for Joe's theory. In other words, I think that was partially showing that, and so did Danny Osborne, and I both interpreted it that way. Now, part of that is because we had a larger disagreement in the team about what a small effect size means, and we can talk about that for an hour. I mean, we can, if you want, we can talk about why that is.
Right.
But it was just kind of funny that me and Danny Osborne, who's a great scientist and a terrific guy, we were just on different sides of this issue, basically agreed it was small support for the rigidity of the right theory. And I thought that because I was involved in the study, it was a very rigid test. It was a very fair test. We did everything we could to make it as fair as humanly possible with pre-testing. I was very comfortable with the test. And when you do all that and you find small evidence that leans in one direction, I think it's meaningful.
Okay.
So that was point one, is I think it did lean towards showing that Yost has a point. Point two is, and I have some other data that corroborates that, which I'm going to talk about in a minute. Point two is that it wasn't a very big effect. Everybody agreed on that. And it's minuscule. So it actually doesn't account for very much of the reason why people update their beliefs. So I wrote down some means just to give you a sense. On a scale of 1 to 100, conservatives updated their beliefs on average 14.6, and liberals updated their beliefs on average 15.8. So there's a 1.2 difference, a very tiny effect size between those two, but there's actually a huge effect for both groups of updating their beliefs a lot. Okay, so comparatively speaking, it'd be more accurate to say mostly this is symmetry. Mostly conservatives and liberals updated their beliefs at about the same rate. A significant percentage of them updated, but liberals did it slightly more. Do you see? So, in the big picture, this really does make a largely symmetrical point that conservatives and liberals are similar, even though I also think it makes the point that Yost made, which is if there's a leaning, it's leaning towards conservative rigidity. I think that's a fair point.
Yeah, no, I think that's something that we're going to definitely get into a little later in the podcast. I do want to get into like the I guess you mentioned the exact effect size, but there's some of the questions that you asked, some of the methodology that you used. And that's all great. And I know one thing I want to point out for our listeners, a couple of things actually, is firstly, you're talking about something called, and let me make sure, because again, I'm a layman here. Adversarial collaboration is this thing that you've been mentioning that we've brought up a couple times. And I think Anthony's going to ask about that in more detail in just a second. But before we do that, I do want you to, if you could, just define cognitive rigidity. I'm sure most people can kind of figure it out. And actually, you know what? Correct me if I'm wrong. It's basically your ability to update your beliefs based on new information and better arguments, right? So if I think the sky is red and you point up and go, look, it's blue, and I go, oh, you're right, it's blue, then I have low cognitive rigidity. But if I go, no, I think it's a weird tint of the glasses I'm wearing, then I probably have high cognitive rigidity. Is that about right?
Yeah, well, that's certainly the way that we ended up defining it in our paper. I will point out, though, that cognitive rigidity has been very poorly defined. So, for example, in Yost's original paper, the sort of the most famous Rigidity-of-the-Right paper, it actually is titled something about the rigidity of the right, and the theory is titled Rigidity of the Right. That's the theory. In that paper, he talks about rigidity. He uses that word 23 times and never once defines it. So,
Right.
okay,
Right.
so it actually has taken on a very vague sense. Somebody said it's been used, I think one paper said it's been used in 25 different conceptual ways. So it's been used to mean dogmatic. It's been used to mean kind of anger. I mean, it's been used, a low complexity has been used as rigidity. So it's been used in all kinds of ways, some of which make more sense than others. And part of what our team did was we started at the far end and said, well, look, what is rigidity? What's the best way to operationalize rigidity? And we actually came to the exact same thing you just said. That was the one thing we all agreed on at the beginning. The best way to think about rigidity, both conceptually and in measurement, is that if someone is unwilling to update their beliefs, that's sort of what the term means, right? Rigid,
Right.
You're not going to move. That's the metaphor. If someone's unwilling to change their beliefs, yes, your metaphor, your example's perfect. If I point out evidence that you're wrong about the sky and you're like, I'm still right, then you're probably more rigid. You're probably more unwilling to update your beliefs on the basis of new evidence. Whereas if you're willing to say, oh, you're right, then you're less rigid. So that's exactly. But we had this part of what I want you to see about the glory of what the adversarial collaboration forced us all to do is it forced all these people from somewhat different backgrounds, even though we all had the same vague sense about what rigidity was and we'd all used the term. Of course, it forced us to define it up front. So we all agreed before we ran the study that this was a good way to think about what that was.
Yeah, and that's an important point for listeners because in the study, before you go into the actual studies, study 1, study 2, and then a combination study, we can get into like how you do that as a scientist because that's extremely interesting when you start to combine these studies and see that these effects pretty much go away. I don't want to say go away, but become smaller, right?
They're very small.
Yeah.
Everybody agreed they were small. There was a lot of debate about what to make of that, which we can talk about. Okay.
And I want to put that to the side because I have an interesting, I think, thought about what to make of it, and I want to bounce it off you and see what you think. I want to retain that in my memory a bit before it get away from me, but I do want to anchor the audience into knowing kind of like the layout of this paper. So you have your typical introduction and the theoretical background and all that. And then you get to this pretest, and this kind of is the place where you guys kind of set the table and organize how you're going to operationalize what you find out where rigidity is, like what you agree upon, and then is that essentially what the pretest would be, to kind of set things up for the next step?
Well, yes, I mean the pretest actually came pretty late because we first had to have a lot of charts in deciding what rigidity was. We had to decide what we were going to do, and we actually ran pretests mostly to see if we could find things that were roughly equal. So we didn't want, for example, to use topics that were somehow more important or that to conservatives than liberals, or that were somehow conservatives would go in with stronger attitudes about them. So we were trying to find, the pretesting was basically trying to find equatable statements that had known properties that were roughly similar for conservatives and liberals before we went in. We also did some pretesting on something I don't know that the paper talked about a whole lot, but we did pretesting on the source. Like, there was a lot of concern from me and other people that if you say the University of Michigan is the source, that liberals are going to think that source is more reliable than conservatives, which might make conservatives look more rigid, but actually it might just be a source. So we were trying to, I don't know if you noticed in the paper, we have like sort of weird sounding university. We have the University of Alabama, University of Michigan, but part of it was to be sure that that was based partially on pretesting. So that's what the pretesting was mostly, was to be sure we had psychologically equatable circumstances that for the beginning of the persuasion exercise.
Yeah. So for people listening, this is the nitty gritty of psychological research. Like, it gets into the semantics. It gets into, because there are arguments that talk about, how even considering left and right as a continuous, like sort of as a dichotomous reality is sort of essentialist, and doesn't quite anchor to reality. But but basically what you're doing, and help me understand, maybe I'm not getting it right, or this will help the audience too. You're finding terms, words, semantic cues, perhaps that kind of coalesce around what we might consider more conservative, what might consider more liberal in our modern sort of lexicon, or our mindset, or modern times. That may not be, in my question to you, is it may not be like universal, perhaps, because things change as the administrations come and go, and as economic distress comes and goes. But are these terms and these proclivities, these ideas, anchored to modern sensibilities as they relate to left and right, and you're trying to capture those through questionnaires?
Correct. So I'll give
Okay.
you an example. One of the pairs, so we presented pairs of terms to people. So one of the pairs was something like this. The national economy does better when a Democrat is president. And then, so that's the liberal leaning of the two.
Mhm.
And then the conservative leaning one was state economies do better when Republicans are governors. So there's evidence that would back up both of those statements. And so what we're trying to do is be sure in the pretesting that those two statements don't combine together in a way that would mean that the first statement's way more important, way more likely to be endorsed by liberals than the second statement's more likely to be endorsed by conservatives. They need to balance out. Do you see what I'm saying? So the point of the pretest was to be sure that on average, we didn't pick things that were just like, wow, liberals really believe in this liberal statement and conservatives don't care about this conservative statement, or something along those lines. So that was to go back to your point about the nitty gritty, that was kind of the point of the pretest, is we did a lot of work to try to ensure what we would call psychological equivalency of these dual statements before we went to the main test. And that was really important to me. I actually was very involved in that because I was very worried we were going to end up with a kind of typical liberal bias where we ran a test that essentially predetermined the conclusion before we started, and therefore, which I think a lot of tests do that, a lot of the measurements do that. They for years have been, we can talk about authoritarianism measurements, which for years have stacked the deck against conservatives in a ridiculous way. So I'm very sensitive to that issue. So that's why we spend a lot of time on that.
Okay, I just want to click on that actually for listeners, and I'm obsessed with this. You know I am. We've talked about this, but this idea of embedded values in assumptions, and for listeners, it's really important to understand that before any paper is even, scaffolded, the psychologist or the psychologists have an assumption. Like scientists always have start with the assumption, right? An assumption for their hypotheses and et cetera. But could you explain to our listeners, and then we can get into the tests and the findings and all that. But I think this is so important. Could you explain to the listeners like what these especially in social psychology, the problem with embedded values, with assumptions, and how they, really set the scene for essentially favorable conclusions? And that'll make sense once you explain what that all means.
Oh, yeah. Well, authoritarianism is a good example. So I'll give you two examples. I think concrete is easier to grasp here. So for about 5 decades, it's commonly used as a measurement of conservatism is the right-wing authoritarianism scale. So Yost did this, okay? You're measuring conservatism by asking people questions like, I'm a mean person who hates everybody and wants an authority figure to do conservative things. So what happens when you do that? When you say I'm going to measure you as a conservative by saying you're going to agree that you're mean and you're racist and you hate people and you're conservative. You have to agree to all of those to be conservative. Here's what's going to happen. Okay, let's take 4 groups of people. Mean liberals are going to score low on that scale because they're not conservative. So they're going to read as liberal. Nice liberals are going to score as liberal. And here's the key point. Nice conservatives are going to score as liberal because even though they're conservative, they're not mean. Do you see? So the only people who are going to score as conservative on this scale that's supposed to measure if you're conservative are mean conservatives. And there's mean conservatives, but I want you to think about that. Everybody should just pause for a minute. If you're just sitting there at home and think about this fact that for 50 years, we often define conservatives as only being mean conservatives, and everybody who was a nice conservative was called a liberal. Now, that's what I'm talking about when you talk about embedded values. So that's an example of what we mean, where we've got a problem that comes before the study you read, that often sits in the background. Okay, it's very pernicious and pervasive. I'll give you another example. In John Joe's famous paper, he used the measurement of dogmatism in his 2003 paper. He used a measurement of dogmatism and claimed that measurement was value neutral. So so you're correlating conservatism with this value neutral measurement of dogmatism. So it basically says, look, I've got this great measurement of dogmatism. It has no biases in it whatsoever. It's not a measurement of conservatism. Okay. Later on, so that was one meta-analysis. Later on, Van Hyle and colleagues used the exact same measurement of dogmatism, also in a meta-analysis on the relationship between conservative and rigidity. Okay. But they used it as a measurement of conservatism because it was so ideologically loaded. In other words, it basically says, I'm dogmatic in only these super conservative ways. Okay.
Wow.
So obviously a liberal is not going to say I'm dogmatic in a conservative way.
Right.
And when we rewrote the questionnaire, we did this simple thing in 2016 where we rewrote the questionnaire, the same questionnaire, to have it both lean conservative as the original one did, and also to have a dogmatism, same statements, exact same language, but just change the target of it to things like climate change and so on, and found that liberals are just as dogmatic. If anything, in our data, they were slightly more dogmatic in that study than conservatives. But that's the kind of thing I mean. We can't even tell the difference between the independent and the dependent variable. That's a problem. That predate. Right. So when you read the study that said, oh, conservatives are rigid because they score high on this dogmatism scale, actually, the scale predetermined the conclusion because it was only measuring dogmatism for conservatives. So we could go on and on. The literature for a long time has been replete. We could talk about social dominance, which problem that still hasn't been fixed. That scale it's been used to make the case that conservatives want to dominate people. Actually, I haven't published this, but we just reversed the valence. I mean, the target of the items, and found liberals do the exact same thing. I mean, I don't think I think we're just it's low hanging fruit. It's kind of hard to publish, but it's low hanging fruit for the curious intellectual to just basically take the scales that have been clearly biased against conservatives, slightly change the target, keep the wording, and show that liberals have the exact same problem if you just ask the right question. So that's what when you talk about embedded values, that's what I think of.
Yeah, for again, our listeners who aren't psychologically or research inclined, saying you're not psychologically inclined makes it sound like I'm saying you're insane. Who are not inclined towards psychology or research in general, psychology research or research in general.
I mean, we are kind of insane. So
we're all crazy a little bit, right?
Yeah,
no, it makes for our listeners who aren't inclined towards psych research or research in general. A couple of things. Firstly, you're highlighting how important good research methodology is, because it's just so easy to design a study that is clearly biased, or it makes it seem like one thing is true, but when really it's not true at all. Research design is something we've touched on a little bit before, but really you're hammering down on the fact that it's like it is so easy and this actually ties in. We talked with Dr. Joe Duarte a while back, and like he kind of was making this point about how the media will just take the headline from a study and run with it. And there's two problems with that. Is A, sometimes they'll take the headline, they'll take like a good study and take the completely wrong conclusion from that study and misinterpret it. But also they'll take a study and they'll maybe interpret it well, but the study itself was designed poorly. So even though they do a good job of translating the study, it still isn't good. And so there's all these problems with like people designing terrible studies. It makes it seem like, conservatives are super authoritarian by nature, and then people in the broader public believe it. And this causes all sorts of downstream problems, which is why something as kind of like niche as good research design actually is critically important for our entire society. But I want to kind of hone in on a couple things, because again, for our layman listeners, much like myself, you're mentioning things like, again, how these studies are badly designed, and you get this sort of, and you've been mentioning these other things. I'm just going to list them out. Rigidity-of-the-Right, Symmetry thesis is a bit of a tongue twister, and Rigidity-of-Extremes. And you've sort of mentioned these, danced around these concepts a little bit. And so I just want to like hone in on them so that our listeners understand what they are, why you were testing them. And then in particular, someone like me reads Symmetry thesis and Rigidity-of-Extremes and thinks those must be like, they sound like the same thing. So in particular, what the difference is with those things, if that makes sense, if I didn't butcher that question, Luke.
No, no, not at all. It's a great question. To start at the last point first, I actually don't think the Symmetry thesis and Rigidity-of-the-Extremes are different theories. This was a point of discussion amongst the group, the adversarial group, because we had a Rigidity-of-the-Extremes. Jan Willem, who's great, was on our team, and I actually think Symmetry is just kind of a macro level view, and Rigidity-of-the-Extremes is something you would expect from any symmetry theory. So Symmetry just means you expect this groups to be roughly the same in their psychological properties, roughly equal distribution of dogmatism, roughly equal distribution of openness. Pick your roughly equal distribution of complexity. So you pick your so roughly equal is what Symmetry predicts. So what my view is that Rigidity-of-the-Extremes just means that for both groups, you're going to have more the people who are at the extreme view. So extreme conservatives and extreme liberals are probably going to be more rigid than moderate liberals and moderate conservatives. That makes sense. To me, that's just a byproduct of Symmetry. In other words,
yeah. I was going to say one kind of like Symmetry seems like the overarching theory, and Rigidity-of-Extremes seems like a natural consequence of that being true.
Yeah, or at least it's a kind of symmetry. You could envision a world where you don't have Rigidity-of-the-Extremes, but you do have Symmetry. In other words, you could have no rigidity at the extreme. Conceptually, they're different in the sense that you can have no rigidity. You could have equally distributed across both conservatives and liberals at the extremes and the moderate, and still have Symmetry. Okay, so they're not necessarily the same theory, but I do think that. So my view is it's sort of an outpouring of any kind of normal distribution and symmetry. But at a minimum, if you have sort of symmetrical rigidity, is one way to think of it, like both sides have the extremes be more rigid to equal amounts, that's necessarily just a kind of symmetry.
Right.
That's just necessarily both sides showing similar effects of extremity is just one way to say it. So I never made a huge difference personally between those two approaches. But if you read the paper, you can tell that the group did. I mean, that was a kind of a big deal. The paper wasn't set up to test my preferred kind of mode of operation, which is symmetry, but moderated by topic domain. We didn't test that extremely well. In other words, my background is, well, look, conservatives are more complex thinkers on some topics. Liberals are more complex thinkers on other topics. You have to know the topic before you can, liberals are more dogmatic about environmental issues. Conservatives are more dogmatic about religion. You really can't even talk about it until you know what topic we're talking about. So we didn't test that very clearly in this particular study. It wasn't set up very well for that. So that's sort of my shtick. I'd also point out to you and to the audience that there's no necessary reason why you would have symmetry. So it is actually, groups do differ on things. Some of those are large-scale differences. So there is a reason to think that even though there are domain differences, as I just described, that there might be an overarching tendency for some groups to be different on some larger variable on average than other groups. And authoritarianism actually, Yost's theory, even though I've been highly critical of it, has a point in that conservatives do, even in our own data, conservatives are more likely to value authoritarianism. Well, that value is the wrong word. They're more likely to acknowledge, that's the wrong word. They're more likely to acknowledge that their group thinks authoritarianism is okay. Well, if you just push that out a couple of psychological steps, okay. So the person who's talking to you about symmetry, who's the symmetry guy, who's been promoting left-wing authoritarianism as a real thing, is telling you, my own data say conservatives are more likely to say their group is okay with authoritarianism, and you just push that out a couple psychological steps. Well, those steps could lead to, well, if your group is more okay with it, we know the value of normative pressure in influencing individual beliefs. That could lead to, on average, conservatives being more likely to be authoritarian because they acknowledge that their group is more likely to accept it. Do you see?
Yeah.
Now, our data also show that liberals are very hypocritical about it, and even though they say they don't accept it, it turns out they do. But so I don't want to make too much of that one point. I'm just saying that Yost's original idea. We've made this point. We published a paper that made this point about how there's a reason to think that because there are these normative differences, that authoritarianism is in fact on average more likely to be accepted normatively by conservatives. There is reason to think that might translate downstream psychologically to a higher level of authoritarianism and conservatism. So that's originally to your question. That's part of the reason the discussion has been happening to begin with, and it's not an entirely unreasonable discussion. Okay, my problem isn't don't talk about the theory. My problem is, well, when you measure it like that.
Right.
When you do it that way,
you have to measure. Again, it's like you have to have good research. Now you have to measure it correctly. In that
incredibly crappy way,
right?
I'm not persuaded.
Yeah,
I need better. Your theory is okay. I just need better scientific evidence.
And my very I guess, oversimplified understanding of this sort of psychological difference on average between liberals and conservatives is that conservatives tend to value hierarchy more and liberals tend to be more skeptical of hierarchy, right? And so even that very basic assumption, which maybe I'm wrong, you guys can correct me, would naturally lend to this idea that maybe authoritarianism is more common to people who value hierarchy, right? That kind of makes sense, but then as someone who maybe knows a little bit more about history, my first thought is to go to something like the Soviet Union, where they were exactly the kind of thing you were talking about. They were espousing equality, we're all equal to each according to his ability, oh my God, I'm forgetting the phrase. I'm mixing up in my head, but you get what I'm saying. They were espousing this idea of equality and everyone's going to get what they need and do what they can, and it's going to be this very fair system. Yet the Soviet Union was just as authoritarian and oppressive as the Nazis and, all sorts of other regimes, except they weren't talking about it that way. Whereas in the Nazi regime, they were like, Hail Hitler, like we're just going to throw up the salute, and they were all about it, right? So they were acknowledging it more, but the effect was the same. So I feel like that's a very obvious
The
example.
underlying
yeah.
substrate, yeah, temperamentally. And go on, sorry, Luke.
Oh, I was just going to say I completely agree with that, and I've made that point too. And I think that there's a danger in both directions here. So one of the dangers is, and liberals do this all the time, is to just recategorize all authoritarianism as conservative. So that's and you raised the point of the Soviet Union. We could say 100 other examples from history. I do think you're right, by the way, and I've made this point also. Very well stated point that I use the exact same example you used about Hitler. You can quote from Hitler. He doesn't say like, let's have equality and then, we're going to take equality way behind the scenes or whatever. He actually says democracy is weak. He actually says like authoritarianism is the only good way. So I concur with that. I will point out there's a danger in the other direction, which to ignore the potential conservative leaning of even some of those liberal areas. So I do agree. I don't like the recategorization. I don't like all of that stuff. But I will say this. Also, data suggests from the, I think, 80s that in the Soviet Union, association with the Communist Party was correlated with right-wing authoritarianism. So some of the authoritarianism in the Soviet Union was very was actually conservative. And so when critics say that, they have a partial point. Okay, and this is one of the things I've been considering is how much of that is kind of built into the product. How much of that is there are just some ideas that are more likely to be conservative, more likely to be authoritarian, or more of these socially conservative ideas. Because I think you can be authoritarian to anything. Research suggests, or you can research suggests. There's this great study that shows both liberals and conservatives are equally likely to resist the tradition. Just depends on which tradition.
Right.
Liberals don't like conservative tradition, so they want to change when that happens. But conservatives don't like liberal tradition, but liberals want to keep the tradition when the prevailing norm is liberal, just as much as conservatives do. So I think there's a danger in overweighing this in either direction and not being willing to look at the honest, blunt facts that don't suggest to me that liberals can't be authoritarian, which obviously they can. Liberals have authoritarian regimes.
Yeah. There's also this really great literature on moral conviction by, I think I'm pronouncing her name correctly, Skitka from University of Illinois, I think. And
I've always said it's Skitka, but I don't know how she pronounces it.
Yeah, I don't know either. Yeah, but
Linda is.
Yeah, and that work is interesting because it really gets to the bottom of how we moralize the issues that we hold so dear, and sort of like moralization as a modulating. I mean, I'm kind of paraphrasing. I'm not saying, but and how it basically you kind of do away with I think she calls it authority independence, where you could be on the left or the right, and rules and laws just become irrelevant if they get in the way of your moral conviction. So you take, for instance, barging into a church service to protest ICE. You really believe you can be, and this has nothing to do really with IQ either, like in terms of, and there's no negative relationship where it doesn't matter. I mean, you could be the smartest person in the toolbox and the sharpest one, and you can hold such tight and strong moral conviction towards something, and the rules won't matter. You become, I think there's another literature on sacred values that basically, we're talking about these more baseline level cognitions, how people then take their convictions to a more sacred values level where they're willing to fight or die for their cause. And I think it's identity fusion literature. So in talking about the things, the kind of like going on what you were saying about how you would like to have, I mean, kind of paraphrasing you too, but have dug in a little bit more into these normative differences and kind of going a little deeper into how the left and the right are express themselves. I find it very interesting. I found it interesting in this paper that, I mean, this is a really great paper, but I also was wondering like where perhaps the individual differences were, maybe trait openness, leaning toward liberals rather than conservatives. And maybe that's why there's more rigidity on the right, a very small effect, because liberals tend to be open to new experiences, and perhaps that's one of the reasons. Had you thought about that, perhaps, about the individual difference component?
Yeah, I mean, to me, they're part and parcel of the same package. So I do think openness has been used as evidence that conservatives are rigid. There's this long-standing association between it. We found it too, that conservatives are less open on those measurements. And I think I actually think that's probably reflective of some underlying reality in our own data. We find it it's left skewing. Even when we do authoritarianism measurements, left-wing authoritarians don't have as nearly a big of an openness drop as right-wing authoritarians do. So I do think that that's probably reflective of some reality. I don't think that's just a measurement issue. This is my take on that. And so, yeah, I do think that's part of it. And it could come from this larger kind of cultural narrative from conservatives about what they value, back to your, kind of circling back to what you said. So, yeah,
Right.
but I don't view openness, the personality part of it. I mean, like when we're measuring that personality, we're just asking, are you kind of an open person, which is very similar to, are you a dogmatic person? We're really just talking about a constellation of traits or
Right.
measurements that are tapping into, to some degree, a larger underlying construct to me.
And it doesn't mean open-mindedness either. That's the difference. People, right? Is that correct? Or the trait openness does not mean open-mindedness, where
Well, actually, let me take this one because I'm curious to see if I have this right, Luke. Correct me if I'm wrong, but trait openness is about, like you said, openness to new experiences. That does not necessarily mean openness to new ideas. So, like, openness to new experiences, as I understand it, is like, oh, you've never had sushi before? Let's try it. Oh, you've never been to Kenya before? Let's go. Whereas open-mindedness would be like, open-mindedness to a new idea about, I don't know, anything really, right? Am I right that's an important distinction?
I mean, yes, that is a distinction that people make. I don't think that I think that those two things are probably related, and I'm not sure that the distinction, and I like openness as a variable, often conceptually includes both of those things. And we've measured both. I'm actually running a study right now where I included some more open-mindedness questions, and they tend to show similar sort of stuff with the kind of traditional openness scale. So no, I don't think of it quite the way, in other words, I don't, to me, that distinction is more content specific than it is this larger distinction. In other words, I think it's more specific than you say. If you ask conservatives, are you open to, going to a different Anglican church, they'd probably say sure. But if you ask liberals, are you open to going to this Anglican church, they'd say no. I mean, I think it's very content, even on the, like, conservatives, are you open to, eating this food that Donald Trump ate? Sure. Are you liberals? Are you open to eating that food? I think it's very content specific.
I'm sure plenty of liberals eat McDonald's, Luke. I don't know.
Yeah. Right. Look, I'm a huge McDonald's fan, and one of my favorite moments in political history was after RFK dissed on McDonald's. Donald Trump made him go and eat a cheeseburger. And I was like, thank you for standing up for the common man. We still like our chicken McNuggets. Okay? Stop telling us. I'm aware they're not good for you and they're barely food, but I like to eat them. They have sustained me for a long time.
This has nothing.
I make the decision on the pro-con analysis. Okay.
This has nothing to do with what we're talking about, but I do have to share, since we're on the topic of fast food, I guess briefly, Luke. Have you ever been to Texas and tried P. Terry's?
I'm from Texas, and I don't know what that is.
P. Terry's is a fast food joint, but it's like, uses all natural beef and stuff, blah, 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 blah. It's like supposed to be healthier in theory than McDonald's. And it's so reasonably priced, and I'm obsessed. It's like it is my treat to myself when I'm like, I need a little junk food. And I'll
Is this a new thing?
I guess so.
Okay.
I just got to Texas in May, and they're everywhere, and they're amazing. So you have to come down and try.
What's the other one?
Good, greasy fast food, that is the place to go, in my opinion.
Okay.
What's the other fast food place in Texas that's popular?
Whataburger.
Whataburger. Yeah, I've been there once or twice.
P. Terry's is way better. It's pretty next
I
level.
have a confession to make. Whataburger I grew up in Texas. I lived there from the time I was 5 until the time I was 22. Whataburger is a Texas institution, and I've never liked it. So
it's just okay. It's overhyped.
They'll never. We always went there after basketball games, and I was like, "Can we please go to McDonald's? Give me some chicken nuggets." I think the burgers are very lame at Whataburger, And they might not let me back into the state if you please cut this part. I want to go. I mean, we go back every Christmas to visit our family. I don't want them to stop me at the border and say, "Give me a Whataburger test."
I'm sorry. This is good. This is going to be good controversial content for a podcast, Luke. We got to keep it in. I'm so sorry.
Never mind the left-right stuff. Yeah.
This is definitely going to be a reel. This is going on the social media. I hate to break it to you. I am curious, what part of Texas are you from?
Waco, Texas is where I grew up.
That's
Yeah,
very
I went
nice.
to Baylor.
I'm in Austin right now.
Oh,
Okay,
Baylor.
yeah.
Or
Baylor.
Buda, technically.
Okay.
Beautiful place. Beautiful. Shall we get into the study, the findings? I'm curious to see what
Absolutely.
you guys found. So, yeah, would you walk us through that?
Yeah, so this was a very big sample as far as these things go. Overall, 6,000 participants. The gist of it is, after giving people pairs of statements, some that were more conservative, some that were more liberal, and then giving them an argument afterwards. So we basically just said, look, here's the statement, here's the evidence that the statement is true, and we got a pre-post measurement to see how much they change their attitudes, after getting data. So it's belief updating is the technical term for that. And we found, as I said earlier, generally both groups updated at moderate rates. So both liberals and conservative updated their beliefs at moderate rates overall. And that there was slightly more belief updating from liberals, and that was true. What statistically significant effect that liberals on average updated their beliefs more. It was very weak, very small difference, which was the primary point of contention amongst the adversarial collaborators. But over the course of these two studies, combined about 6,000 participants, we found that conservatives had a very weak tendency to be more rigid, less likely to update their beliefs across a lot of these. We had 3 or 4 different pairs that we had pre-selected, as we've already talked about with pre-testing. And the other thing I will point out is that the group by far that showed the least updating were extreme conservatives. So that group was especially unlikely compared to extreme liberals to update their beliefs, again providing some fodder for John Jost to come and say, as Danny Osborne did, that these are at least somewhat supportive of the rigidity of the right. So that's the basic finding. I will remind the listener that even though there was evidence of rigidity of the right, it was very, very tiny. It's hard to state this in strong enough terms how small an effect of a beta 0.03 is, but it is a very tiny percentage of the that's so small that many of most of my, other than me and Danny, I think most of the people on the team said that's not even big enough to count. It doesn't matter that it was statistically significant. A lot of people said that's so small. I have my own reasons for thinking it's still meaningful, but most of the team besides me and Danny, the two opponents, most of the team besides the two of us thought that it should just be dismissed as nothing, so that's the high level summary of the paper.
There are so many, and like you, I mean, I'd imagine you look at that effect size or that beta, and you think, I want to capture what could be making that difference. Is that kind of where you're going with that?
No, I think the reason I trust it is because we set the test up as a very, very balanced and a sort of extremely balanced test. So going in, I would assume that the effect size would have to be small. Okay, so I think we set it up in a way that forced any effect sizes to be small. So if we found anything to me that was meaningful, and we did. I think, my read of it is it was very small, but the overall effect for the main measurement, as I viewed it, of conservatism and liberalism showed a small leaning towards conservative rigidity. So I think that's scientifically fair to say that John Jost has some support for conservative rigidity. It's tiny, but he has some support for the fact that there's a very small leaning for conservative. And I have other reasons for thinking that too. By the way, this is consistent with a meta-analysis that Tom Costello and colleagues did, which also showed when you account for a lot of different factors and try to have a fair test, a slight leaning towards conservative rigidity. Okay, it's consistent with not 1, not 2, not 3, but 4 of my most recent papers. All 4 of them have shown a slight leaning towards conservative rigidity using 4 completely different kinds of tests. So I shouldn't say that. I counted this one as one of the 4. So three additional papers plus this one have all showed a leaning towards conservative rigidity. So, and I can go through them. One of them has to do with the January 6th paper that's not published, and then I've got 2 published papers, one on 59 nation study on authoritarianism and threat, and another published study on incongruent authoritarianism. All of them show a slight leaning towards conservative rigidity. I just think the preponderance of evidence right now suggests there's a small, very small but real leaning to where conservatives are probably on average in this country especially, but around the world more likely to be rigid.
So, but it sounds like, again, that is and this is where it gets really interesting, right? Is that it's really small. It's definitely. It seems like it's definitely there, but it's small. Would you say it's small enough to be more or less negligible, or do you think that when you kind of zoom out to the population level, it has a big effect? I feel like it is maybe riding the fence on whether or not that it could be.
I think that's a fair question. And I'm of 2 minds about it. And the first one, Anthony hit on this earlier. As a scientist, no effect is too small for me to be interested in. Okay, so that was so I mean, as a scientist, I want to know why that's happening, and I don't want to dismiss it out of hand, especially when it's congruent with a lot of other scientific evidence from my own lab and other labs. So I'm as a scientist, I'm interested in it. Now, to your point about its societal impact, I think that's a variable answer. Now, part of me wants to say no, because symmetry is more important, and right now we're at a point where, as both sides are just accusing the other side of stuff that's mostly crazy, I think that there is a danger in taking this very, very tiny difference, blowing it all out of proportion culturally, misrepresenting it as if conservatives are rigid, and that's more of a danger to me than the fact that conservatives are slightly more rigid. So that's point 1.
Yes. Yeah.
Point 2 is, yes, it's so small that you could legitimately argue that it doesn't matter. Okay. Point 3 is rigidity is not always bad. We haven't talked about that. No one wants you to be open-minded about slavery. Okay. You should have a really rigid opposition to slavery, and nothing should be able to persuade you to own a slave. So rigidity is, we've written about this. Peter Sudfeld has talked about this a lot. Phil Tetlock's talked about this a lot. I've talked about this a lot. All of us complexity researchers keep telling people complexity is not an unqualified panacea. It's really bad for your health, by the way. You don't want to have a complex view of losing weight to lose weight. In our research, you don't want to have a complex view of quitting smoking if your goal is to quit. You need to have a simple view. So there's a lot of ways in which rigidity is actually not normatively negative all the time. Yeah, so I don't want to make too much of that either. Okay.
That brings up an interesting thing that I was thinking about that I think maybe it bears mentioning now is like in this study, you ask people, you give people these statements, right? Like, actually, I just want to read this because I just think it's worded funny and it made me chuckle. The one about presidents and for liberals, it was compared to past American presidents, Donald Trump is uniquely simple-minded. I love the use of the phrase simple-minded. And then, of course, for conservatives, it's Joe Biden is uniquely simple-minded.
Both true, by the way. Those are, we published a paper.
I have to say, I feel like both of those are true.
Yeah.
But, I'm someone who let's take Joe Biden for the example, just because of his what to me is very obvious cognitive decline. I would have said, at least at the end of his not his second term, at the end of his term, like the second half of his term, he was, in a sense, very simple-minded, and it would actually take a lot of evidence to convince me otherwise because of what the other evidence that I had seen that had and read about, that had convinced me of this position. So there is something to the idea that, like, if you give me a statement that I agree with, like, I don't know, let's say that Joe Biden was experiencing real and substantial cognitive decline, at the very least towards the back half of his term. And then presented me with evidence to the contrary, I don't think the appropriate response is to say, oh, okay, you're totally right. It's to say, okay, I'm not quite convinced, but I should be a little more open-minded to further evidence of that point. You know what I mean? It's like it's exactly what you're saying. You don't want to be so open-minded that the second you get new information, you change your mind, because you'll be constantly changing your mind. You do want a little bit of skepticism, a little bit of gatekeeping in terms of what evidence you accept and what how much evidence it takes for you to actually change your mind. It is a balancing act, right?
I 100% agree with everything you just said. I don't think it's rational to be completely open to everything. That's actually insane. that is a guaranteed recipe for psychological misery. So
Yeah, right.
and also inaccuracy. So yeah, no, I agree with that. I mean, I think we tried to deal with that in this study by presenting things like, okay, Joe Biden is uniquely simple, which liberals would be more likely going in to not want to believe. This was 2022, so they'd be more likely going in to not want to believe that. And whereas you say, Donald Trump is uniquely simple-minded, conservatives are more likely to not want to believe that. And then we gave them evidence, scientific evidence, which, by the way, comes from my own work, which shows that both of them actually are uniquely simple if you compare it to the average American president from history. Now, it's a little more complicated than that in reality, just for the record for the audience, because actually part of that effect is that both of them are at the end of a long decline, societal decline in complexity for U.S. presidents. So some of it is probably Biden's cognitive decline, but some of it actually is accounted for by presidential complexity has been going down for both parties since the 60s.
Yeah.
Okay.
Trend.
So,
yeah,
a trend. But we separated that out, and part of it was for both of them. Part of it is they're uniquely simple. Okay. So we gave evidence to people. Now, here's the point. If I'm giving you good evidence in a scientific article of something that you don't want to be true but probably is true, you probably ought to at least consider that evidence. That's the spirit of what we were trying to do, is say to liberals, look, you may not want to believe that Biden's simple-minded, but here's this scientific paper from a credible source that shows that he probably is. It ought to change you, at least the calculus, a little bit, so you're a little more open to the idea than you were before if you're being honest about it and you're not just holding the line for no reason other than you don't want that because you're rigid. You see? So I think that's the spirit of it. But you're absolutely right that that doesn't translate to a societal, like, we should all just be open-minded all the time. That's
right.
I wrote a book called Complex Simplicity, which explicitly had a chapter arguing against that point of view. That's just not a good way to live.
Right, and it flies in the face of this notion that liberals or progressives, however you want to frame it, are very open to all things or tolerant, because clearly that's not the case, right? They have parameters too. They have injunctive, they make injunctive statements. They have rules. They have in and out, group parameters, like I said, and they're very rigid about how they kind of configure their normative palette, if you will. I mean, they come up with these particular code words that are condensed to mean so many different things at once. There's dogmatism, going back to our earlier sentiments and points before. So it's just not true that liberals are, quote, just more by default more open. There's definitely rigidity there. It's just a different streak. Would you say that's pretty much summing up what you're saying too?
Oh yeah. Look, when being progressive is fine. When people had a progressive bias, if you will, towards COVID, that's not the issue. But when I go to a faculty meeting at the University of Montana and I present evidence from Ivy League studies that says maybe we should stop and rethink what we're doing a little bit, and those Ivy League studies are called, and I'm quoting, conspiracy theories that anyone could get off the internet, end quote, I think we've got a rigidity problem. Do you see that? So it's fine it's even fine to challenge the studies, but no one challenged the studies. No one actually said, wow, here's the reason those methods were bad. No one actually gave a counter argument to any of the arguments I made. They just declared me a conspiracy theorist and moved on with their lives. Well, that's bad rigidity, and both sides do that. When you get to that level, I do think that's bad. In other words, because you're not you don't have to agree with the evidence or even change your opinion always for the evidence, but you should consider reasonable evidence in the calculus. Okay. And so yeah, and progressives are terrible at it. They're really, really bad right now, frankly, subjectively at it.
You might have noticed that as well.
Yeah.
yeah, exactly. Could we, Clay, unless you want to take the next thing, I'm curious if maybe we can go into like how that is presenting itself in our culture today, like how these different, the left, right.
Go for it, Anthony. I think that's super interesting.
Because listeners, I don't know, Clay, if you have the the political. Well, we don't take political data from listeners, but like, I would imagine that a lot of people that listen to this podcast are sort of curious, epistemically curious and intellectually humble. We just hope that that's the case. So there's a few things I'm curious about for you to expand on. Is this notion that I keep hearing, at least on my social media, my following, saying that there is, okay, it's actually kind of funny because both ends say this about each other. There is no such thing as right-wing extremism or authoritarianism. That's really just leftism. And then I got, there's no such thing as left-wing extremism. It's just right-wing. It's just like, so maybe to not make it so nutty and confusing, could we just at least pinpoint where we might be seeing these extremisms happening in front of us right now, left and right, just to kind of set the tone for listeners?
Yeah, I think it's a fair question. I would say, I'm a conservative Christian, so I would say this before we start, that I'm consistently annoyed at left-wingers calling everything white supremacy. They've made the term meaningless. They call, so I share a lot of the frustrations with people who say the left is categorizing everything as, white supremacist, authoritarian, fascist, name your term. They've actually made even a term like the far right. They've made that term meaningless to me. So because far right to them means reasonable immigration policy. Like they're not okay.
Right.
So I share a lot of the frustrations of people who say the left is accusing the right of authoritarianism when it doesn't exist. And we have a thing we've produced called the Authoritarianism Tracker at Grove City College through my lab, where we track a lot of the modern events for how authoritarian they are on both sides. So we do this. So if you want details on some of these things, you can go and find our write-ups. But for example, a lot of the stuff about ICE, we tend to give it pretty low scores for Trump authoritarianism, even though the left consistently says that it's, a sign of a huge dictatorship. I don't think a lot of that is authoritarian at all. Sometimes we give low scores just because of the way that Trump pushes the boundaries of executive authority often. So we're concerned about that. But so I don't think anybody that calls him fascist, I think, is just silly to me right now. So a lot of this stuff. So this is a precursor to something will sound like bad news to conservatives. Is I'm actually very sympathetic and feel a lot of those things too. And I consistently criticize liberals who do that kind of stuff. That said, data overwhelmingly from my lab, and I'm just remind the audience, I'm the left-wing authoritarian. Like I'm the guy who says, let's be concerned about left-wing authoritarianism, and I am deeply concerned about it.
You quite literally wrote the book on the subject.
Yeah,
I wrote it out there. Yeah,
thank you. I wrote a book called Liberal Bullies. So I'm just pause and think about that for a minute. And I'm the person that wrote that book, and I'm telling you, as a scientist, there is a right-wing authoritarianism problem in this country. So I don't think if you're conservative and you just want to bury your head in the sand and ignore that problem, that's a healthy response. In fact, the primary thing that conservatives, in my mind, can do right now to help the country is turn a bit more inward and fight that on their own side. They'll win more votes that way. I keep saying the first party that figures out that they're going to win more votes by playing nice with the other side is going to win the next 3 election cycles. So they're going to win more votes that way.
Yes.
By doing that, it's better for it's self-serving, in my opinion, as a political analyst. But independent of that, it's the right thing to do to help. Why? Because nothing kills authoritarianism across the board like an equal principle. And if you see it on their side and you call it out for that, you got to call it out on your own side. Now, I was wrong about something. Now I'm going to answer your question. I didn't get to your question. This is the answer to your question. Okay. I was wrong about something. So that's just data. That's just data points. I got a lot of data points. I could show you thousands of participants worth of data that suggests we still have a right-wing authoritarianism problem. And our data suggests it's a little bit more of a problem on the right than the left in terms of its scope, in terms of its breadth. But I don't think it's more of a problem in terms of its depth, because the left-wing authoritarian movement's more inclined to political violence. It has a lot more negative qualities to it. Okay. Now, to your question, last time I came on, I made fun of people who said that conservatives believe in Hitler. Okay, I talked about data. I've collected data that says that's not true. The mean scores in our data for asking questions, do you support Hitler? Liberals think conservatives support Hitler, and almost none of them do. Like the mean is at the very bottom of our scale. So I made fun of that. I'm not surprised by the rise of right-wing authoritarian pushback, because that's what happens That's why authoritarianism is a cycle. You have these left-wing authoritarians that were in office and did all these things for 4 years under Biden, and now there's pushback. It tends to create alienation and so on. So I'm not surprised by that. I was a little taken aback by the explicitly pro-Hitler conservative movement that's mostly among young people has been okay. So I've talked to some people because I was a little skeptical of this at first, and I do think in the main conservatives are not supportive of anything like anti-Semitism. Part of it is I was raised in the South, and look, I was raised in a somewhat racist culture, okay? But the one group we were never allowed to be racist towards was Jews. Like, we were all taught Jews are God's people. You better support Israel. Like, it's actually the sort of anti-Semitic component of it kind of caught me by surprise. And so my sort of bold prediction that this wasn't going to be a problem at all has not entirely borne out. It's mostly borne out, to be fair. I think conservatives have largely fought against it, and I could give examples of that too, but not as much as I wanted them to. So I think so if you're looking for places you can see clear kind of Nick Fuentes and that kind of crowd, the Tucker Carlson, Candace Owens, that crowd, which has a lot of following, okay, I think you can look at a lot of authoritarian statements from that. Now, also on the right, again, I voted for Trump. I'm glad about that vote. I'm not ashamed of that vote at all. I don't think Trump's a fascist because he's using ICE. But he does have a tendency for executive overreach. I hate the things he says about Greenland. I do hate a lot of so we gave Greenland, I think, 3 boots out of a 5-boot scale. So we've given, he just like Biden ignored a Supreme Court decision, a 9-0 Supreme Court decision, and did something with TikTok anyway. We gave that a very high boot rating, just like we gave Biden a high boot rating for doing the same thing. So I do think he's got a tendency for strong executive overreach, which sometimes borders into the realm where you're concerned about authoritarianism. Now, Biden did a lot of that too. So I think the Democrats were worse when they were in office, if you want my honest opinion. But I'm just saying, we're in a stage where we are in danger of spiraling a bit into an authoritarianism tit for tat cycle. And the best way for conservatives to stop that is to not be authoritarian, to recognize you have a problem sometimes. It's going to be an unpopular message, but to realize that you do have it doesn't represent all conservatives. In fact, it represents a small minority of them. But to fight against that in your own ranks would be advisable.
Yeah, I can just tell you straight out straight up that I get messages on my Instagram account when I post. Okay, so for instance, when Alex Preddy was shot by the ICE agent, backtrack. When what's her name? Renee Good was killed. I saw that as generally, essentially, as an act of self-defense. I know that there are, a few details here and there that people contest. But this Alex Preddy one, I took it to a very different level of analysis. I was able to, on my own volition, without jumping into the media, look at it with my own eyes and see something's not right here. And so a few days go by, I don't say anything on social media. I don't like to jump in right away. And you get conservative commentators on Instagram, your influencers and your creators who are just to the death defending the ICE agent who did what he did. And some of them are former cops, and some of them are just diehard. And they were acting quite maliciously toward those who were pushing against them. And I was basically saying publicly, you're doing exactly what happened just 5 minutes ago with the left doing what they did to you. So I said, it's okay to criticize what the president is doing with ICE on several issues. And it's okay to admonish and criticize Kristi Noem for telling us something that actually didn't happen before our eyes, while maintaining your support for the overall project of deportation and of border security. So is that kind of that's the message I wanted to relay to listeners. And is that kind of what you're saying, is like how to be steadfast in your principles, but also have a, open, be targeted in how you're going about this rather than being sort of belligerent?
That's
right?
exactly what I'm saying. I don't think we should be anti-woke or pro-woke. We should be pro-truth, which is what you're saying. There has to be a standard. In other words, if this was a shooting that was illegal, then we should prosecute that according to the law, no matter what
Right.
we think about ICE. We have to separate out those issues. And I think the right thing to do is to be honest about both the positive things that ICE is doing, and we don't have to back off of that. We don't have to agree that you're fascist if you're a member of ICE. We don't have to agree with the idiot DA of Philadelphia who said he was going to go after ICE people like they were Nazis. Right. We don't have to agree with any of those left-wing narratives to say that when a left-winger says this didn't look like a lawful shooting, we can say, well, and when Kristi Noem says these just crazy things that we can all see are untrue, which was a huge, huge mistake. Very Biden-esque, just telling us what we're all watching was not true.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So just like that's but to Trump's credit, he seemed to walk that back a bit in terms of his administration. Okay, seemed to kind of read the room a little bit about that. But so yeah, I agree. But the point is this: I think it's a danger to go in either direction. So the danger is, and the country tends to do this. Like now, people are like, well, we don't want ICE. Well, that's actually going after the wrong thing. The thing is about the truth. The thing is about what happened in this. Also, just because if this shooting was wrong doesn't mean the protesters are right.
Right. Yes.
I'm so sick of this narrative that me voting like Trump. One of Trump's two main issues was what he was going to do with ICE. He ran on this. Okay, I voted for that. Okay. I used to be. It's a democracy, and now he's doing it. And these are our laws. So if you don't like the laws, change them, but don't try to. It's actually a crime to impede federal officials, and it should be. So I don't have a problem at all with ICE doing what it's doing, as long as they do it well and within the scope of the law. If they don't, then we should stop whatever that part of it is. But let's don't make the mistake of acting like the use of ICE in general is terrible. Okay, so on both sides of that, I think you're right. I think there's a danger if we don't communicate, if we just go from one extreme to another and we don't ever stop and say, well, this is the part I agree with, what
Tit
ICE
for
is
tat.
doing, and this is the part I don't agree with.
Right.
And we can acknowledge the other side has a point when they do, which in this case they clearly did have a point. I don't think if we don't apply the equal principle, we're never going to get there. So I think you're exactly right, Anthony.
It's what I like to call, and I'm sure I'm not the only one to come up with this framing, but it's team-based thinking versus principle-based thinking. And I think just so many people in this country, unfortunately, whether they realize it or not, have team-based thinking. My team good, your team bad. Whereas I think you and Anthony and myself, we all have, or at least I try to have, principle-based thinking, where it's like I'm on teams. I'm not afraid to say like I'm generally on this team when it's appropriate, but it's because the things that whatever team or whatever group I associate with generally stands for the same things I stand for. So even the people I choose to identify with, the groups, the movements I choose to identify with, I identify with them because they conform enough to my principles. Right. And so when you have this principle-based thinking, you can say, for example, I'm a progressive, let's just say, and I don't like ICE. But when they go after someone who is a child molester, as they sometimes have done, I can say, well, that's good. Or if I'm someone who's like, I support ICE, I don't like when people protest ICE, but I believe in their right to protest. I don't like when I don't like that there are illegal immigrants in this country and I want them to leave. But even though I don't like protesters and I'm support what ICE is doing, I can still call out, like you said, Luke, when someone gets shot completely unjustifiably. There's just the Freddie shooting was pretty black and white. That was a street execution for no good reason. They had him subdued. He had a gun on him, but he wasn't brandishing the weapon. This is cut and dry.
Right. Like Kristi Noem
and
was saying.
the Renee Good shooting is a little more of a gray area, right? And people forget there are levels of analyses. You can say what Renee Good was doing was stupid and putting herself at unnecessary risk. And you can say that officer maybe had reason to I'm sorry, that agent, the ICE agent, had reason to believe that his life was at risk, or at least he was at risk of serious injury. And you can also say maybe the way he handled it wasn't great. And if he had handled it differently, he wouldn't have had to pull out his gun, or he wouldn't have felt the need to. And there's so much nuance that people just lose because of team-based thinking, right? So
100% agree.
It's well worth people, I think, doing some introspective thinking and going over in their own heads and their own hearts, like, how do I approach issues? Is it with my gut, or is it with my head? No, is it with this team-based thinking, or is it this principles-based thinking?
Then you get into the issue of social media, though, and media generally infiltrating people's minds and creating shortcuts and quick narratives that just confirm bias. And so it's like we have a public that is just intoxicated by the media, and it's really hard to move that. Going back to rigidity, it's really hard to move people from one way of thinking to another. They're just so stamped in to their perspective, and social media doesn't help with that.
Yeah, well, we definitely all agree on that. I'm sorry to cut you off, Luke, but I know we're getting kind of close-ish to time, and I want to leave enough space for you to talk about the last thing. I want you to be able to get some airtime for this, because I think it's very exciting, and that is SPSP, which stands for, and I'm going to make sure I get this right here, the Society for Personality and Social Psychology, which you are going to speak at here. When is it going on, Luke?
February 27th to the 29th, I think. It's something in that range.
Late February.
Yeah,
we'll
late
say.
February, for sure.
Right. And you're going there to speak. And the reason that this is interesting is because, and I'll let you kind of get into more detail, but is because this organization is both traditionally seen as very important to the field of social psychology. This is a conference, right? But also has received quite a bit of criticism from people, I think, like yourself, who are more in your milieu, for being extremely progressive biased, extremely left-wing biased. I will say, actually, I'm just going to do a quick aside here and say that we've been using the terms conservative and liberal. I do take issue sometimes with the use of those words, particularly when it comes to authoritarianism, because liberal, by definition, means free, which is anti-authoritarian, and conservative in the American context, in theory, should mean conserving the checks and balances on authoritarian power and freedoms and liberties and all this. And so there is an issue. I do take issue with the term. It's not your fault, Luke. I'm just saying I'm taking issue with our whole society that uses these terms, and I think they get muddy. But also, I'll say that this organization has a progressive left-wing bias. Maybe I'm not going too far saying that they have a woke bias to some degree. And so someone like you, who is a Christian conservative, like you said, who takes a more middle of the road, even right-leaning approach, and has that bias and that lens, right? Going to speak is interesting, and I think potentially cause for optimism when it comes to breaking that bias in that organization. But I'll let you take it away, Luke. What are you going there to talk about, and what do you make of the fact that you are going to be sort of the black sheep, the odd man out there?
Well, okay, so we have this symposium which is called, is SPSP a healthy organization? And you rightly said SPSP is one of the most influential organizations for psychology research in the country. I mean, it's the largest social psych conference in the world. It's a huge organization with massive reach. So we're just going there to basically ask the question, are we okay? I mean, I'm an elected fellow. I'm an elected research fellow in the organization, which was one of the proudest moments in my career. Okay, so I've been an associate editor for almost 7 years at the flagship journal. So I'm deeply embedded into this organization, deeply invested in it. I have a lot of good colleagues and friends in it. So, and we're going there to basically say, look, are you guys too woke to make a difference? If you've lost your way. And we've got 4 talks. So Lee Jussam's going to give a talk, which the title of is SPSP is a Bad Society. So that kind of says, up front what he's going to say. The great Lee Jussam. Then we have a talk that's going to be more empirical by Nate Honeycutt, which is going to kind of do a linguistic analysis of bias in the field, kind of a woke progressive bias. Then I'm giving a talk about how we've abandoned the scientific method. Okay. Well, I'm asking the question if we have abandoned it. The title of my talk is about the two faces. Like SPSP claims it's pro-science, and I think it is it has that face that's legitimate. I don't think it's actually an artifact. It's not just posturing. It's partially posturing, but it's not just posturing. Okay. And I'm going to talk about how we're losing that. We've lost our belief. We think the scientific method, and for many people at SPSB, is an artificial cultural construction rooted in white supremacy.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I don't think it is. I think it's actually a pan-cultural truth. Okay. The logic of the scientific method is actually just as true in ancient Egypt as it is right here in where I live in Western Pennsylvania. So I actually don't adhere to that view. I actually think it's representing a pan-cultural truth. And I think that's a reasonable. So I'm going to make that argument. It's a pan-cultural truth. Then I'm going to say, well, do y'all believe that? And here's why I don't think a lot of you do believe it. And here's why it's going to happen to us, which is going to be a disaster if we don't go back to really firmly instantiating that. But I'm kind of the moderate on the panel. I have deep ties to the organization. I quite love it. I have a lot of fond feelings towards it, a lot of good colleagues in it. So I'm not ready to throw out the baby with the bathwater. I don't want to burn it down. I want to help move it back to a more scientific approach. And then we've got the brilliant Ann Wilson, who's going to give kind of a pro SPSB, we're actually doing better than these crazy guys say we are kind of talk. So it's going to be fun. It'll be interesting. I've always had good relations with a lot of the people at SP, but the night is young. We'll see how it goes. After I spend 12 of my 14 minutes lambasting them, we'll see.
Well, I mean, the thing is, you mentioned Yoast or Jost. How do you pronounce this? Jost.
I'm actually not sure, and I think it's Yoast.
And I think
sort of go in between.
Yeah, kind of like Yoast, like sort of an in between sound. Yeah.
Depends on how
John, if you ever
you're
listen
feeling.
to this, I'm sorry that I don't know how to pronounce your name after 20 years.
Well, he's quite the published. I mean, he's published so much in the field of social psychology and now in social neuroscience too. And which I take great issue with social neuroscience. That's a whole other can of worms. Maybe, I guess maybe I would love to hear, because you mentioned him several times. I'd love for the audience to get to know him a little bit through you and why his work kind of stands as maybe a somewhat of an issue for the kinds of things that you're saying right now about the scientific method and assumptions. And really, it's kind of a selfish question on my end too, because I'd love to hear from your mouth why this person whose work I read often rubs me the wrong way. Maybe help me understand that.
It rubs a lot of people the wrong way. But I will say this before I start. John and I get along fine, and he was very gracious. We had a symposium a few years ago at SPSP that we worked on together, which was basically asking the left-wing authoritarianism question. Back then, it was still kind of taboo to say there's a left-wing authoritarian person at all, believe it or not. Okay, so they were arguing that there really wasn't such a thing. So we had kind of a pro-con symposium, and he was very gracious to have that symposium and to have a vigorous debate about it. And I've always gotten along with him fine. Interpersonally, I like him a lot, and I think he would say the same. We get along fine. But we'd also disagree, and we both know that we disagree. Now, to your larger question, sometimes I feel like because he left Twitter and he went to Blue Sky, he and I used to debate on Twitter sometimes, and he left to go to the Blue Sky echo chamber. So I don't know. I don't follow him because I've sort of refused to go over there and stayed in the public market in Twitter. But I'm kind of often his biggest defender on Twitter. So I think he's got some merit in his work. People want to throw out the baby with the bathwater. His system justification theory, which is this idea that we have this motive to justify the system, which I think is accurate in as far as it goes. My problem to your question with a lot of John's work is it purposefully only asks the question from one direction. So I think that conservatives do have a system justification, and you can track that. They want to believe they live in a good system. They want their nation to be a good nation. They want to believe that and sometimes that can lead to biases, which is his point. He's right. My problem is that's also true of liberals, probably in equal proportion. But he doesn't ask that question very often. He asks the question only from one direction. And he has a lot of pushback when you try to ask the question from this is how left-wing authoritarianism went. When you try to say, well, I'm saying the same thing that you're saying about right-wingers. Okay, sure. I'm saying the same thing about left-wingers, and he kind of draws lines in the sand sometimes that he knows I don't agree with those lines. I just think he's so, and we've talked about some of the biases in measurement, and I think you'll see that a lot. If you know, I've had people read papers from him like, doesn't this seem like a biased measurement from a Yost? I'm like, yeah, it doesn't seem like it. It actually is biased. It actually isn't giving conservatives a fair shot. Okay.
Yeah,
So
right.
that's what I would say about the larger issue. But I'm not. I think it's half right, and it's just the half that it doesn't get right. It doesn't explore. That would be what I would say about a lot of his work. I think he's got a lot of points.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean,
I know
well,
that's
his,
not what I'm supposed to say. I'm supposed to be the anti-Jost guy,
oh
but
no,
I
No.
quite have a lot of positive views of his work, and I don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. I just want to correct the problems.
I'll say this, or Jost, whatever it is. Depending on, I mentioned earlier, it depends on how European you're feeling. If you want to say Jost or Yost, open invitation to come on the podcast. I think that's only
that would
fair.
be-
Open
would-
invitation. We'd
that would
love
be
to
an-
have him on. We'd love to have you on,
I would,
Mr. Yost.
everybody would listen to that. So
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, like, I read his work, and I see a great scientist there. You know, I see obviously an incredibly well known and highly published and just reputable scientist who I just completely disagree with when it comes to framing a question. And then putting measures to it. You know, it's just like you're right. I mean, I was reading through his social neuroscience review or something, I can't remember, and there's so many really good points about the brain and how we reflexively make judgments, and intrinsic versus extrinsic motivations, and just all these baseline primal, primitive, whatever you want to say, things that are human. But it's just that you don't ever see the left being tested on these grounds. And that's my complaint about, like, I'm just echoing exactly what you said. And I just wish that, that would be different. And it's not really from his
I
end.
will say, I agree with that. I will say two quick things about John. First of all, probably the greatest day of my career was when John Jost wrote a paper, and in that paper, he attacked my left-wing authoritarianism scale item number 19. And I knew I had gotten to that moment. I'm like, I've really arrived. Like, one of the most famous academics in the world is forced to attack one of the 20 items on my scale as being a bad item. And it probably was a bad item, but it just doesn't matter because we throw the item out. It's one of 20. It doesn't matter. But I'm like, I knew that was my moment of like, oh my goodness, I've really hit something. I've hit a nerve with a really famous guy. The second thing I will say is, do not underestimate his scientific acumen and intelligence.
Oh, yeah.
Because I've debated him, and he's one of the few progressive academics that I've debated that have said things like, he made some attacks on my paper and I made fun of him for those attacks. And then he came back and made a very intelligent argument about it. And I was like, oh my gosh, he's right. He has a point. So like he actually is a very, very insightful, incredibly smart person who I think does a lot of good work. And I have a deep respect for his intellect. I do not like the fact that he just seems to really dislike conservatives and never ask the same sort of questions about liberals, in my opinion, that he ought to be asking. He never does the full-scale symmetrical analysis, in my opinion.
And this is a frightening thing because this stuff makes it independent of how I feel about him. I don't even know the guy, but this is what makes it into this information disseminates out into the world, into the media, into the public, consciousness, and then this is where you get these solidified, calcified ideas that conservatives are evil, going back to the beginning of our discussion.
Right.
The moral issue is a problem.
Yeah. I know we're pressed for time. I know we're really pushing up against time, but I don't really want to end without highlighting a little bit of how influential, and I'm not trying to, butter you up, but we have you here, and I want to, first of all, thank you for the work you do, just generally speaking, but of course also giving us some insight, a lot of empirical insight into left-wing authoritarianism. And I know that we touched on it throughout this entire episode, but if you could give I know this is torturous for a researcher, but if you can give us something of a synopsis on your work on your really kind of seminal work on left-wing authoritarianism as it contrasts with the broad literature of right-wing authoritarianism. Is that too much to ask to for you to do a little bit? Yeah. Okay.
I'll give you the
Maybe we
quick.
could end
No,
with
no.
that. Okay.
I love the question. It's just
Yeah.
a dangerous question to ask an academic, but I love the question.
I know.
So the long history of authoritarianism research has been focused on finding right-wing authoritarians, and the main scale that came out of that for basically 2 decades before we came along was the right-wing authoritarianism scale from Altmaier. So that was the main thing. All we did, and Altmaier, by the way, said there's no such thing as a left-wing authoritarian. Okay, so, and he was not exactly a left-winger. He was kind of a moderate, but he really ruined left-wing authority. And I loved his work, but he really ruined left-wing authoritarianism work. So he said that. I can't go into the nitty-gritty here for time's sake, but he wrote a scale for left-wing authoritarianism that was so bad that when I finally read it, it was one of the most shocking and alarming days of my career. So because he didn't do the thing that I would have assumed he did, okay, which was take his right-wing authoritarianism scale, keep all the language. So it says things like, I want an authority figure to crush my enemies, and it would name a conservative authority figure and a liberal enemy. I assumed he would keep all the language the same and just reverse the valence and say, now I want a liberal authoritarian to crush a conservative. He didn't do that. He didn't do that obvious and straightforward thing. So that he did something absolutely. He basically created a screener for a terrorist group that nobody would want to do, conservative or liberal. It was just a terrible questionnaire. It's epically horrible. Okay, questionnaire. So we did the simple and obvious thing that he should have done from the beginning, which was rewrite his scale, keep all of the authoritarian language, but just change the targets to liberal authoritarian leaders and conservative, outgroups. And we found basically the similar sorts of patterns. Liberal authoritarians look a lot like conservative authoritarians on a lot of dimensions. Now, not all of them, as we talk about in the book, not just our lab, but other labs have found this too, that liberal authoritarians, at least in the U.S., tend to focus more on censorship than conservative authoritarians do. So they're not entirely equivalent groups. Liberal authoritarians tend to be more complex on average than conservatives. So there's differences that go kind of valenced in both ways. But basically they're very similar kinds of people with very similar motives, with very similar outcomes. So that's all we did using questionnaires, using that kind of the same method that Altmaier did. We just reinvented that for liberals and found, guess what? Guess what? We weren't making up all those liberal regimes that were authoritarian. That history didn't lie to you.
Yeah,
there really is such a thing as a left-wing authoritarian. Your mean uncle that you think is a liberal authoritarian actually is.
You're telling me the Khmer Rouge was authoritarian, Luke? That's shocking to me.
It's just a stunner to think that, right? Wow. Who knew that someone who said they were liberal and authoritarian and did all sorts of evil authoritarian things was an authoritarian? Who knew? Okay, it's weird. I will say this is the last thing I'll say about it, is I think this has largely been an academic blind spot in terms, because the populace, there is a blind spot. We talk about in that book, even for the populace, okay? But just to give you a flavor, like in 2020, John Jost's lab said, this is like finding a left-wing authoritarian is like finding the Loch Ness Monster. Like they just basically said,
I've read that.
Okay, that was 2020.
Yeah.
They've softened now, I think, because that just didn't work. It was just so obviously untrue. So, but that's what they said. That wasn't that long ago. Now, contrast that with our data from around the same era where we asked Americans, average Americans, how many left-wing authoritarians do you know in your life? Just the average American. The average number was 6. We also asked them, from left-wingers, we also asked them, what's the most authoritarian person in your life? 25% of left-wingers said the most authoritarian person in their life was a liberal. So I think the populace has long been aware of the fact that there are biases in how people view it, don't get me wrong, but they've long been aware of the fact that there really is such a thing as a liberal authoritarian. Academics have just stacked the playing field for so long against it that we weren't able to see it. So.
Well, I just want to point out that I think Nessie's real, so.
There's that, right? I love Nessie.
I'm a big Scotland fan. I'm a fan of I've been. I love it. I want to believe. I want to believe.
Let's take a trip over there and see if we'll go together and we'll have confirmation bias to the max and see if we can find Nessie. Okay.
Hell yeah. We'll make it like a History Channel style doc series about looking for Loch Ness Monster and left-wing authoritarians. We'll just do them both.
Famous podcaster Clay Smith and left-wing authoritarian researcher Luke Conway on a journey of discovery.
Scuba diving in Loch Ness.
Right.
Yeah.
Somewhat precarious, elusive, concerning music in the background, sort of just
right.
up to the top. Yeah.
Honestly, I might watch that. So
That'd be fun.
yeah, all right.
Well, that is just too good. I mean, I think we've come full circle to I don't know if we've come full circle. There's so many things to talk about, but this has been so much fun, and I just have so many things going on in my brain right now. I could talk to you for hours, Luke, but I think we're gonna wrap it up. And if there's anything at all you want to tell the audience, I mean, you mentioned a few books that maybe we'll definitely post in the show notes, but if you want to mention them now, then that'd be great.
Yeah, I've got a book, Liberal Bullies. We talked about that. I have a book of apologetics book called Complex Simplicity, which basically defends the Christian faith if you're interested in that sort of stuff. I'd also really like to plug our authoritarianism tracker. People don't like unbiased analysis often, so this is trying to be even analysis of both sides. So we track left and right-wing authoritarianism in real time as events happen. On our Substack authoritarianism tracker. So if you're interested in that, you want to kind of get a sense of, we're going to try to judge fairly based on scientific criteria. Now, it's a bit of a scientific art, okay, but to judge on scientific criteria, we give boot ratings from, chill out, this isn't authoritarianism at all the way up to 5 boots, which is, run for the hills kind of. So I would like to encourage people who were interested in that kind of thing to go to our Substack at Authoritarianism Tracker and sign up, and you'll get the updates as we post them of various events.
Yes, and I just want to say, we'll link everything in the show notes, and if anyone is interested in buying Luke's book, which I'm personally going to do, please use our Amazon affiliate link that'll be in the show notes, and that link will take you to Amazon, and we'll get a small kickback. It's the best way to support the podcast financially at no extra cost to yourself.
Support this podcast. It's great.
Oh, Luke, you're making me blush.
I love this podcast. This was a fun hour and a half, man.
This was great. This was great. Thank you guys so much for listening, and we'll catch you in the next one. Bye-bye.
Thank y'all.
For us,